Some of you may or may not be exposed to Disney's Plus's one of their more recent shows, the show What If. And like all good TV shows that maybe we come to love and to enjoy, this show has a simple and yet complex plot. But the simple definition of this show is there's very familiar Marvel stories that you may have seen in theaters or also on Disney Plus. They are also on there. And they take familiar stories that are dedicated to 2-hour-long movies, and they chop them down to about 20-minute episodes and examine what might have happened if something had turned out differently. What would have happened if Captain America had not been at the right place and the right time in order for him to get the super soldier serum in order so that he could be stronger, not just this wimpy guy. Perhaps something might have turned out differently, and in this show, Peggy gets the serum instead. And there are so many other familiar stories that this TV show series takes, and it makes them different because there is some kind of different outcome, there's a different action that is taken, and it makes for a different kind of story. And you can take this for any story that you might be familiar with, and as kids, I think it's really fun, at least it was for me, to imagine if I was a certain character in a certain land, and if I had done this action or taken this step, what would have my journey have been like? What would have turned out differently as opposed to these characters? Tonight, it's not really about the Marvel characters that I think is so very fascinating about that show. And I think it's something that brings out a question that we probably had since time began. And that question is, what would it be like in my life if I had taken a different action, if I had maybe had a different mindset this day? What kind of opportunities would I have taken that maybe I didn't take, either because of my mood was one way that day, or maybe it was because there was a certain person who influenced me to maybe be more afraid that day, or maybe in the opposite, what are some good opportunities in my life that I would never have taken if I had not been built up or encouraged by someone else? There are so many different things in our life that we ask ourselves all the time, what if? How might have things turned out differently? What might have been the different thing? Tonight, I want to examine with you an interesting topic, and I think it's one maybe at first glance that we may shy away from, but I think it's something that is very important for us to ask because this is a salvation issue, and it can impact our spiritual destiny. And that question is, what if our actions did not matter? Now for me, just to be personal with you, I would be quite afraid of this question. It's quite intimidating because everything that I do and try to do in my life, I'm very goal-oriented. I like to have things done in the proper order, in the proper steps. I like to have my life figured out. In sophomore year of high school, I thought before then, even like in 8th grade, I thought I had my 4 years of high school exactly how I wanted them to be. I was going to take these steps, and I was going to go to a certain school. I was going to be in a relationship with this certain person. I had some of that stuff in my mind that I thought figured out. And as a lot of you already know, that kind of stuff, a lot of it did not turn out the way that I imagined it at all. And by 10th grade, I completely thrown that aside, and I went in a completely different direction in a lot of ways. For just to keep it real, one of the things I realized is, you should actually probably be a good student. That's kind of important for you to do. And it's important to be diligent and to be hard working. There's so many other things. So tonight, really, and especially I think in our society today, it's very dangerous, or it seems very uncomfortable for us to imagine what would it be like if the actions that we are taking, it seems like we have just this step in our plan for our lives. Even if we follow those steps, and a lot of us are afraid to even follow those steps, what would happen if none of that matters at all? I want you to turn with me in the Bible to Matthew chapter 7, verses 22 through 23. And I want you to look at this with me from the perspective of Jesus. And like I said, this is extremely important. In the context of what Jesus is talking about here in Matthew chapter 7 is he is wrapping up his Sermon on the Mount. And that is an amazing lesson, and we're all familiar with it to one extent or another. But in Matthew chapter 7, verses 22 through 23, Jesus says something that's very interesting, and I think we can miss a lot of what he's trying to say and read over maybe some of the things that he's implying. Matthew chapter 7, verses 22 through 23, Jesus says, "Many will say to me in that day, 'Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" And this is very interesting. We can read this, and oftentimes it doesn't really hit home with us. I think probably because of the things that Jesus describes in the earlier passage, in verse number 22. These people are saying, "God, didn't we prophesy in your name? Didn't we cast out demons?" And today, that doesn't happen for us, right? We cannot do those miraculous gifts. We cannot have those actions because we do not have those things anymore. And so it's really easy for us, I think, to read over this and be like, oh, that's their righteousness, and it doesn't really hit home with us. But if you want to take it one step closer, I think, to your personal life, just maybe read it like this. I don't think it'd be any injustice to what Jesus is saying. Jesus might be saying to us, "Oh, Lord, didn't we go see many sick people in the nursing home? And Lord, didn't we go to many funerals? And Lord, did we not go on many mission trips or help with hurricane relief or do all these amazing things in your name?" And perhaps that's maybe what Jesus is saying. And he's saying in verse number 23, it says, "Then I would declare to them, 'I never knew you, you who practice lawlessness.'" Now, the question, what if our actions don't matter? We have to go back a verse as well, I think, when we're examining this question is, what about doing the Father's will? Because do our actions completely not matter? And that's something that we're going to grapple with for the first little bit. And that's something I really want us to consider. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, Jesus says this. He says, "Not everyone who says to me on that day, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven." And so Jesus is saying in verse number 21, it seems maybe a little bit contradictory, perhaps. It's saying that he who does the will of my Father is the one who is going to go to heaven. So it seems that Jesus is saying that these people who are practicing their actions, that they are lawless in some ways. What they are doing is not in accordance with God's will, but it also seems like that what they are doing is the right things. Like the apostles cast out demons in people's names, and the apostles have these spiritual gifts. So these don't seem to be wrong actions initially by the people. But yet Jesus is saying these things are not valid. These things are not pleasing to my Father's will. So what really is Jesus saying in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 21? I want you to think about several possibilities of what did Jesus mean. First off, did Jesus contradict himself? And before you completely throw this out the window, I want us to think about this for a minute. Did Jesus, who said he was the Son of God, did he contradict himself by what he is saying? He said that these people who seemingly did these righteous things, that these people are not in accordance with God's will. And is it because they took action? Is that condemning them, taking those actions? And Matthew chapter 7, verses 16 through 18, Jesus seems to suggest that some action has to be required in our lives. In verse number 16, Jesus says, "You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit." And so, naturally, it seems to us in this fruit analogy, and again, at least starting to be in my generation, we probably don't appreciate this as much. I have had some experience with gardening from Dad in a little bit. We didn't have a garden every year, but we had some attempts when I was younger, and he's also trying to do it right now, for better or worse. So, and I think he would tell you he's not the master gardener. So that's up for debate somewhat how much I understand this. But what Jesus is telling us is the results, right? We're really result-driven in our world. That's something we can claim onto. We really want things fast, and we want results. And that's what Jesus is saying. He says, if there is something that's good in our lives, if these people are producing these good things, you should be able to see that in them. And also the same thing for bad things. If you skip back a chapter, Matthew chapter 6, Jesus also seems to suggest that there are actions that need to be required there. He says, when you do a charitable deed, in verse number 2, not if you do a charitable deed. Jesus seems to be implying that there is some action that is required. Again, in verse number 5, when you pray. He seems to suggest, again, there's some kind of action that has to be required of us. That seems to be a little bit in contradictory to what we have been talking about. So is Jesus really contradicting himself? And for most of us tonight, I think we can say, Titus chapter 1, verse number 2, God cannot lie, and Jesus is the Son of God. And to make a longer answer more simple, this doesn't seem to be a very viable option, although there seems to be some discrepancies that hopefully by further study we'll be able to see how do these things resolve themselves. The second question about what did Jesus really mean in this passage is, did these people lie? These people that Jesus is talking to in Matthew chapter 7, are they lying about doing all these amazing things for Jesus? Do they just come up with the idea that they performed all those righteous deeds? Are they just lying to God? Are they just trying to plead out mercy? God, we did all these things. Is that a possibility? And if so, we know that cannot be pleasing to God. Lying cannot be pleasing to God. Revelation chapter 21, verse 8, and if you will turn with me there, it's not on the screen for you, but it is a challenge. It's a passage that hits home because there are a lot of things that we look down on in this passage that have a very strong stigma in our society. But there's also one that's mentioned near the end that maybe hits a little bit closer to home in that way. Revelation chapter 21, verse 8. It says, "But the cowardly, unbelieving, abominable, murdering, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and," get this, "all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death." Now, it makes kind of sense, I think, in verse number 8, the first few things that he mentions that these people deserve death. The cowardly, it's really easy, I think, for us to knock people for their fear. We have such a courageous society that we prop up bravery in a lot of ways, and that's good and that's right. So we throw cowardly out. Yeah, they deserve maybe that lake of fire. Unbelieving people, that makes sense. Like, if you don't believe in God, then like why should you have any part of what he offers you? Those who are abominable, those who do terrible, awful things. I think of terrorism in a lot of ways. There's also a ton of different abominable things that could imply a lot of different things. Murderers, that seems obvious to us. Those who take the life that God has given us. The sexually immoral, again, it seems very obvious to us. Sorcerers, idolaters. But then he says, and I think it's interesting, the way that, where he puts it, at least in our English translation, I've not looked at this too much, but it says, "And all liars shall be thrown into like a fire." That's interesting. Of course, all these sins and every sin deserves death, but he places the emphasis on all liars at the end. And sometimes it doesn't seem like if I try to mask the truth or if I try to maybe tiptoe around it, that doesn't seem like such a bad thing. But what it is saying here is all liars who do not follow God's plan for their lives, that is something that is very unpleasing to God, and that's something that will ultimately result in spiritual death. So are these people lying to Jesus? And if so, it would seem to make sense about their spiritual fate. But I don't think that's exactly what it is either. We've already talked about this, Matthew chapter 7, verse 23, but Jesus is saying those who practice lawlessness. And so what is really that lawlessness? And I don't think it's lying. I don't think these people are lying to Jesus about this one lie, because Jesus is saying that they practice something. In other words, I think that's a routine that they've fallen into. And so really, what is that? And that's been the question maybe that you've been itching to know all along. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 23 and verses 27 and 28. And I think we're going to get the answer that Jesus is really looking for, that these people are doing. Matthew chapter 23, verses 27 and 28. And most of you probably already know where this is going and what Jesus has already said to this point. But suffice it to say, Jesus is again here, and it's in a different context than the Sermon on the Mount, but Jesus is being very strong in his emotions right now, and he is not holding back from letting these people know what he thinks. Matthew chapter 23, verse number 27, he says, "Woe," which is not necessarily like a horse, but it's a strong condemnation. So Jesus is basically telling us, pay attention, this is not good. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." A lot of, in my past, and 12-ish years, I got to perform in theater every single year that I was in school, and theater was a lot of fun. And when you are in that, we are taught to take on the role of a different person. I'm not acting as Adrian Judd. No one wants to come see a play where I act like myself. They can do that for free anytime that they want to. So you have to take on a different role. One of my favorite ones was Shere Khan. And if you don't know the story Jungle Book, that's the antagonist. That is completely, in some ways, opposite of my personality. I had to take on a complete hatred in a lot of ways. And I was talking about this with some friends last night. It was different for me to try to feel for that character. And what you're taught in acting is to take on that role. You're supposed to learn eventually to think in the mindset of someone else so that that acting proceeds from you naturally in a lot of ways. Jesus is saying here, these people, they appear, and they put on a really good show, they appear to be righteous. They seem like they are doing everything right to everyone around them. And bear in mind, these people, which we already have the stigma of when we hear a Pharisee, a scribe, or a hypocrite, like we are already disassociate with that so much. Those are those people. That seems so foreign to us. Like we don't have these religious people that come through anymore for us, like in the church. Like we don't have people, that's that person, they're better than everyone else. Like that seems so distant foreign to us, but Jesus is telling us these people appear to be righteous. They appear to have it all together, and they seem to be doing everything right. And if you look again in the Sermon on the Mountain, you can see examples of all the ways that they do that. Maybe it's by their prayers. Maybe it's by the way that they serve other people. They appear to have it all together, and yet Jesus says, these people do not. They are practicing lawlessness. They are not in accordance with God's will. So what is it that the Pharisees are missing, right? Because we want to practice righteousness. Like we want to do God's will. We want to be pleasing to him, and it seems that our actions not necessarily are the things that merit us, that God's grace in those ways. So what really is it that puts us in a right standing before him? I want you to know tonight, it is our actions and our intentions that are both vital. And Jesus has a lot to say about each one of these. And to make a long story short-ish, our intentions can be if we have the right motivations, that will merit our actions to be the right thing. But if we are like the Pharisees, if we just appear to be taking these actions, our motivation behind them can be completely undercut. They can be completely for nothing. Matthew chapter 7 and verse number 24 again, Jesus hammers this home. He says, again, concluding the Sermon on the Mount, that action is paramount. He says, therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the familiar story follows. But notice, he says, it is not just enough to listen to what he was saying. That is not all that counts. What counts is doing them. So we know that action must be required, but just as importantly, our motivation for taking those actions also has to be vital, or we are just like the Pharisees. To be honest, there's nothing that would separate us if we have the wrong motivation. And what is that motivation that we should have? 1 Corinthians chapter 13, which was written by a former Pharisee by inspiration of God, which I think is funny in a way. But Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 1 through 3, he gives us the key that we need to take as our motivation. He says, Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. So, how can we develop this proper intentionality that is well-pleasing to God? We have to look to the perfect model that is God and God's love for us. 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 through 10 gives us that perfect example of how we should model our motivation for showing the love of Christ to other people. And first, we must understand that we should serve a God of love. That is what he is, and this is what goes on 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 through 10. And I'm going to read through those as well. John writes, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. In this the love of God was manifested toward us, that God has sent his only begotten Son into the world, that we might live through him. And this is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us, and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins." And it's so easy, I think, to breeze by this entire passage, but there is, again, so much and yet so little that we're going to spend on tonight. But I want you to realize 3 C's about God's love, and then we're going to talk about how we can show that love of God to other people. So first, we must understand what kind of love God has for us. In 1 John chapter 4, verse 8, we have to understand that God's love for us is constant. And this is something that's so unbelievable because everything that is a part of us is not constant in some ways. It's amazing to me. I know very little about biology, but the way that our temperature works in our body, if it was just a little bit off, like our body would be so messed up. And yet the way that we like heat and cool our buildings and stuff, like it is multiple degrees off and then it corrects itself. But if the body did that, like if it operated on that same system, we'd be completely messed up. And it's constant. What God's love for us, the very definition of love is God, and that's so hard for us to wrap our minds around. Before we were even in existence, God had love for us, and he had us in mind. And that's an amazing idea to me, and I could talk about and think about that all night. But secondly, we must realize that God's love is consecrating. In 1 John chapter 4 and verse 9, God sent his Son for us so that we could have the opportunity to be saved through him. And that is an amazing, like that Jesus came to this earth. He lived and he died and he suffered and he was resurrected again. And it's all because of God's love. It's because he wanted to save us, even though there's nothing that we could do necessarily deserve, which leads us to 1 John chapter 4 and verse 10. It's not that we loved God, but that he loved us. This was a conscious love. God had us in mind, and he knew we would mess up because he knows everything, and yet he still chose to do that for us, and that's amazing. And again, we can talk about God's love for the remainder of the night, but I'll leave a lot of that more to your own personal study, and I hope you will take that time. For us, though, I want us to examine for the last little bit, what does it look like for us to develop and to show that love that God has for us? And I think it begins with our mindset. 1 John chapter 4 and verse number 11, John writes, "Beloved, if God so loved us," and he does, and we know it, and we can see it, and again, we can talk about it all night. We know that, and it's amazing. "If God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has seen God at any time. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love has been perfected in us." In order for God's love, I think, to become a part of us, we have to develop, we have to cultivate the right kind of mindset for that to happen. And that takes a lot of different things, as we're going to look at just one of them after this. But one of the things that it takes is to, again, look back to God's model of love, and we have to be willing to give up who we are so that God can show his love through us. And we can talk about light and other things as it regards that. There's so much that goes into having this kind of mindset. The other thing is we have to realize that if we're going to show that love to other people, if we're going to have that, we have to take effort. Romans chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. Again, this is Paul writing, and he's talking about different characteristics that us as Christians should have. And he says, let love be without hypocrisy. That's interesting, what we already talked about tonight. It needs to be genuine. It needs to be right. He says, let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another. I really like how the ESV translate the last part of verse number 10. It says, in that version, outdo one another in showing honor. Like, it's almost like a competition, I like to think. The way that it's phrased there is we need to be constantly looking for ways that we can look out for other people. And if we do that, and if we're all doing that, then all of our needs are going to be met. And this is not some kind of just big socialist thing or anything like that. It's about showing genuine love that God has for us. And it's about having that kind of community that we can lean on each other in difficult times and be there to be better for God and show his light to a dark world. And one of the hardest passages in the Bible, if we have this genuine love, we'll have this result, is in Matthew chapter 7 in verse number 12. Jesus says there, therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. And again, this is one of the hardest passages. We have to treat people how God would treat them in a lot of ways, not necessarily how they treat us, but about doing the right thing, even when it is difficult and when it is challenging. Tonight, I want you to know it has been fun maybe to think about in our lives, what if I had taken this action, or what if I had done this, or if I had done that? And it's fun to think about while we're here on earth. I want you to know, in eternity, if there is one game I do not want to have to play, it is the what if game. I want to be done with that because it drives me crazy right now. And if I have to worry about that in spiritual condemnation, nothing else that I do on this earth will matter at all. And so we want you to know tonight that God doesn't care about different things maybe that have held you back in your past. He wants you to come to him. He wants your full dedication and your full love. In John chapter 14, verse number 15, it says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. That's the words of Jesus. He's not saying if you had not done this or that. His love is unconditional for us. And that way, he offers that to us. And I want you to know tonight that the devil loves to get into our motives and loves to mess us up in that way. And if he can get us just to be a little bit off, then maybe we'll have a little bit of hypocrisy and stuff. But God's grace is willing and is able to overcome that. Tonight, if you have never become a child of God's, we would highly encourage you to do that by taking these steps and having that faith in Christ and taking advantage of his grace by taking these actions and having the right motivation. And for those of us who are Christians tonight, if there is anything that is keeping you from holding back the love that you know that you need to show to other people, but also show to your God, why don't you make that right tonight while we come and as we stand and sing together.